The courtroom was silent, but my chest felt like it was splitting open. I could hear the soft tick of the wall clock behind the judge's bench. I could hear the slow inhale and exhale of my mother's breath. I could even hear the faint scrape of my father's shoe against the polished floor as he shifted comfortably in his seat. They were relaxed, confident, certain. Their lawyer leaned back with the smug ease of a man who believed the ending had already been written. He tapped a gold pen lightly against a thick leather folder, smiling as though this hearing were nothing more than a technicality. I sat there, Alyssa, the daughter they thought they had broken, the girl they believed was drowning in the very incompetence they had manufactured for me. Then the judge adjusted his glasses, glanced down at the paperwork, and began reading the list of my assets out loud. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever had to build your own sanctuary in silence. I watched the lawyer's gold pen stop mid-tap. The rhythm of his smugness died the moment the judge reached the second page of the disclosure. His face didn't just lose color, it turned the shade of a bad debt, gray, hollow, and utterly worthless. Beside him, Tiffany's polished facade began to crack. Jeffrey's shoe stopped scraping the floor. The comfortable, arrogant silence they had cultivated for decades was suddenly replaced by a chilling, clinical realization. They finally understood that the Alyssa they were trying to crush, the irresponsible, unstable girl they had described to the court, did not exist. Most people would have had a breakdown when they were served with papers claiming they were financially incompetent. Normal daughters would have called their parents crying, begging to know how they could be so cruel. But I stopped being a normal daughter the day I realized my family was just a corporation with a failing board of directors. To me, this wasn't a family betrayal, it was a hostile takeover attempt. When the notification of their lawsuit hit my phone at 11:51 p.m., I didn't feel my heart drop, I felt my focus sharpen into a laser. I didn't cry, I didn't ask why. I sat down at my desk, opened my secure forensic server, and began the one thing I do better than anyone else in Manhattan. I started an audit on my own life. By 12:03 a.m., I had already initiated the protocol to lock down my private accounts. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, not to summon regret, but to clear my vision for the data streaming across my screen. This wasn't a mental breakdown, it was a balance sheet. For 28 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the emotional bill for their status while they overdraft on my compassion. Now, the account was closed. They wanted my bank accounts, my car, and the $4 million penthouse in Brooklyn Heights that I had purchased with my own sweat and precision. They told the judge I was reckless. They claimed I was a child playing with fire who would burn through Eleanor's legacy in a month. Their lawyer had smiled at me as if this were all a minor technicality, a foregone conclusion before they could drain me dry and put me under their thumb again. He thought he was dealing with an impulsive girl who had stumbled into money. He didn't realize he was dealing with a forensic accountant who had been documenting their greed since she was old enough to understand a ledger. Inside my mind, a different kind of sunrise was glowing. The kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet, lethal retribution. I watched the lawyer stand up so abruptly his chair screeched across the floor, a high, desperate sound that echoed through the room. He was realizing that my armor wasn't made of glass, it was made of undeniable, forensic truth. My childhood home wasn't a sanctuary, it was a compliance center. In the hollow halls of our Manhattan townhouse, love was never a gift, it was a transaction. You paid for affection with absolute, unblinking obedience. If the board of directors, my parents, decided the sky was neon green, you didn't just agree, you filed a report on the vibrancy of the hue. My brother, Dylan, was a master of this system. He didn't have thoughts, he had echoes. He stayed close, he asked for permission to breathe. And in return, he was rewarded with a constant flow of praise and a safety net made of Eleanor's money. I was different. I was built with a forensic mind that couldn't stop auditing the gaps between what they said and what they did. When I asked questions, I wasn't being curious. In their eyes, I was being defiant. When I noticed the inconsistencies in their stories, I wasn't being smart. I was being difficult. By the time I was 12, they had officially labeled me as the irresponsible one. It was a convenient tag to place on a child who saw too much. It made them feel secure in their power to dismiss my reality. For years, I wore that label like a shroud. People often see the silence of a victim as weakness, but they don't understand the survivor's invisible chain. I wasn't being passive, I was a black box, quietly recording every bite of data, every lie, and every overdraft of my parents' integrity. I realized early on that if I fought them out loud, they would just increase the volume of their control, so I went silent. I became a ghost in my own life, a data entry clerk for their corruption. The first real audit happened when I was 22. Jeffrey, my father, had hit a snag with the logistics firm's quarterly reporting. He thought I was just a quiet girl with a talent for numbers, so he handed me a set of private ledgers and told me to fix them. He wanted a mask for his failures. What he got was a mirror. Within 4 hours, I found it. The first $500,000 he had siphoned from Grandma Eleanor's personal accounts to cover Dylan's gambling debts. I didn't tell him. I didn't scream about the betrayal. I simply made a digital copy of the proof and stored it in a folder I'd been building since I was 19. I fixed his books, watched him exhale with smug relief, and realized that our relationship wasn't a family bond. It was a subscription I was paying for with my silence, but the subscription was getting too expensive. I didn't move out because I was angry. I moved out because staying meant shrinking until I disappeared. My father used to tell me that life would humble me. I believed him. I just didn't tell him that I was the one who was going to be doing the humbling. I tracked every dollar. I lived in a studio with walls so thin I could hear the city breathing, but for the first time, I could also hear my own thoughts. Privacy became my armor. I needed them to underestimate me. I needed them to believe I was struggling while I was actually building an empire of truth they couldn't even imagine. The warmth that Tiffany and Jeffrey had faked during the first week after the funeral didn't just vanish, it evaporated, leaving behind the freezing, jagged edges of their true intent. They realized that their soft concern wasn't going to get them a seat at the table of Eleanor's $30 million empire, so they did what any failing board of directors does when they can't win a fair vote. They began to smear and sabotage. They stopped calling me their daughter and started calling me a failing asset. The first major blow came in the form of a legal affidavit. They didn't just want the inheritance, they wanted to strip me of the life I had built entirely on my own. In the paperwork they served to the court, they claimed that my $4 million penthouse in Brooklyn Heights hadn't been purchased with my earnings as a forensic accountant. They lied under oath, claiming those were stolen family funds, siphoned from the logistics firm years ago. They were trying to manufacture a crime to justify their hostile takeover. It was a calculated attempt to frame my independence as a theft, to turn my greatest achievement into my prison cell. Jeffrey didn't stop at the courtroom. He took the fight to the one place he thought he still controlled, the boardroom of the logistics empire Eleanor had founded. He spent a week quietly meeting with the senior board members, offering incentives and future favors if they would vote to strip my authority before I could even take my seat. He painted a picture of a mentally compromised woman who would run the company into the ground. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a liability that needed to be liquidated. Watching them move with such practiced malice, I began to understand the trap of cruel normalization. This is the psychological mechanism where a family like mine survives by making their abuse feel like standard procedure. For years, they had treated me as a scapegoat not because I had failed, but because my success didn't fit their narrative of control. In their world, cruelty was normalized because it served the bottom line of their narcissistic egos. They didn't see their lies as evil, they saw them as necessary business strategies to protect a status they didn't earn. Every time I had to walk into that family townhouse during the legal proceedings, the air felt thick and heavy. The grand hallway, with its imported marble and gold leaf mirrors, always smelled of expensive perfume and rotting integrity. It was the scent of a legacy built on performance rather than character. I realized then that my parents' greatest fear wasn't losing the $30 million, it was the fact that a failing asset like me had actually become the most powerful person in the room. They weren't fighting for the money anymore. They were fighting to keep their own empty masks from falling off. Sarah's office did not belong in a building that offered comfort or coffee to grieving families. It was a sterile vault of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, a place where emotions were filtered out by high-frequency air scrubbers before they could stain the carpets. Sarah herself was an extension of that environment. She didn't offer me a seat out of kindness. She offered it because a stationary target is easier to audit. She was the precision attorney I had sought out, a woman who viewed the law not as a pursuit of justice, but as a series of high-stakes calculations. We didn't waste time discussing the betrayal of my parents. In Sarah's office, we used the language I had mastered during my years of silence. We discussed breached contracts, unauthorized withdrawals, and the failure of Tiffany and Jeffrey to maintain their fiduciary duties as my supposed guardians. I had brought the folders of truth with me, 3 encrypted hard drives and a physical ledger that contained every financial footprint my family had tried to erase. I watched Sarah's eyes scan the first set of documents. These were the records of every wire transfer from Grandma Eleanor's offshore accounts that I had quietly protected long before she passed. For decades, my parents had treated Eleanor's wealth as a pending deposit, A lifestyle subsidy they were entitled to simply by existing. They had been living in a state of cognitive dissonance, spending money they didn't have while calling me irresponsible for actually managing what I did. I explained to Sarah how I had built these files. Every time my father, Jeffrey, asked me to fix the books for his failing logistics projects, I wasn't just balancing his ledgers, I was conducting a rolling audit of his greed. I documented the $1.5 million he had attempted to hide in shell companies and the $500,000 he had siphoned to cover Dylan's gambling debts. I wasn't their daughter in those moments, I was a black box recorder, capturing the data of a family in freefall. Love, in my family, had always been a subscription service. As I sat in that office, I realized I had finally hit the cancel button. My compassion had been a luxury resource that they had overdrawn for 28 years. Now, the balance was zero. Sarah turned the monitor toward me, her face a mask of clinical approval. She showed me the counter-audit she had performed on my parents' legal filing. They had claimed I was financially incompetent, but their own records showed they couldn't account for nearly $3 million in assets Eleanor had entrusted to them for the logistics firm's operations. The folders of truth were more than just evidence, they were a professional reckoning. I had mapped out every lie Tiffany had told about the family funds used to buy my penthouse. I had the bank statements from my own independent salary as a forensic accountant, proving that every square foot of that apartment was paid for by my own precision, not their imaginary charity. Sarah leaned back, the fluorescent lights reflecting off her glasses. She didn't smile, she was far too professional for that, but there was a lethal clarity in her gaze. She closed the primary folder and tapped it with one manicured finger. They think they know you, Alyssa, she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold finality. That's their mistake. They're still playing a game of emotions while you've already finished the audit. The office lights hummed at a frequency that usually indicates a pending failure, but Sarah's focus was a perfect circuit. She didn't look up when she slid the final printout across the desk. It wasn't a bank statement or a stock report, it was a kill shot. I looked at the line item, $1,500,000. It was a wire transfer from Jeffrey's private holdings, executed 3 days after Grandma Eleanor's funeral. The destination wasn't an offshore account or a luxury real estate escrow. It was sent to a corporation called St. Jude's Sanitarium, a private, high-security mental facility in upstate New York known for its discretion and its permanent residents. I stared at the name of the facility. I didn't feel the cold bloom of fear, I felt the familiar, analytical click of a missing variable finally fitting into the equation. My parents didn't just want my bank accounts or my penthouse, they were auditing my life out of existence. They were purchasing a silence that a lawsuit could never guarantee. Sarah flipped the page. Beneath the wire confirmation was a voluntary admission form. It was a legal bypass, a document designed to waive my rights and hand over control of my physical person to the medical staff at St. Jude's. At the bottom of the page was my name, and next to it, a signature. As a forensic accountant, I have spent thousands of hours analyzing the friction between ink and intent. I know the rhythm of a pen, I know how a nervous hand creates a stutter in the tail of a Y, and how a greedy hand applies too much pressure on the downward stroke of an A. The signature on that form was mine, but it wasn't. It was a perfect, clinical forgery. It was a signature I had seen before in the family ledgers when I was 22. It had Dylan's distinct signature style, the slight, arrogant lift at the end of the loop, a mark of someone who believes they are too clever to be audited. My brother hadn't just echoed our parents' opinions, he had drafted my death warrant. They weren't just after the $30 million, they were buying a life sentence in a locked room for their irresponsible daughter. They were treating my freedom as a depreciating asset they needed to liquidate. My mother, Tiffany, had cried about my instability in her affidavit, but she was really just managing the public relations for a kidnapping. I closed the folder. The room smelled like sterile glass in the finality of a closed ledger. I didn't feel sadness. Sadness is a luxury for those who still believe in the contract of family. I was strictly focused on the logistics of the retaliation. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were sharp, reflecting the fluorescent glow of the monitor like a predator sensing a terminal weakness in its prey. The audit is complete, I said. My voice was flat, a monotone of absolute certainty. They aren't just trying to take the money, they're trying to delete the person who knows where it's hidden. Sarah didn't smile, but she tapped her pen against the sanitarium papers with a rhythmic, lethal precision. We didn't need to discuss the next move. The data was undeniable. The villains had moved from civil theft into criminal conspiracy. It was time to enter the courtroom and deliver the Manhattan verdict. The courtroom was silent again, but the pressure had shifted. The soft tick of the wall clock behind the judge's bench felt like the rhythmic countdown to an inevitable liquidation of my parents' status. Tiffany and Jeffrey were still wearing their respectable, harmless masks. But I could see the fine cracks in their composure. Their lawyer had stopped tapping his gold pen against the leather folder. He was staring at the primary folder Sarah had submitted, the folders of truth, containing every digital footprint they had tried to erase. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at my parents, his expression hardening into the granite focus of a closing audit. He began reading the list of my assets out loud, and the numbers echoed through the room like a series of terminal balance sheet entries. It wasn't just the $30 million from Eleanor's empire. He read the confirmation of the $4 million penthouse in Brooklyn Heights, registered solely in my name and paid in full with my independent salary as a forensic accountant. He read the records of savings accounts I had opened years before the inheritance, documenting a level of foresight and financial discipline they had claimed I didn't possess. The lawyer's smug ease evaporated into a shade of gray that matched a bad debt. He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the polished floor, but the judge didn't look up from the trust documents. This trust, the judge said, his voice dropping into a register of cold finality, was established prior to the deceased's passing. He looked directly at me, and it was created by the respondent specifically to protect the estate from misappropriation and unauthorized withdrawals. Then Sarah delivered the finisher. She stood and pressed play on the final digital recording. My parents' voices filled the sterile room, stripped of the soft, concerned tones they used for the court. They weren't discussing family or my supposed instability. They were discussing the mechanics of the $1,500,000 wire transfer to St. Jude's Sanitarium. I heard Jeffrey's cold, calculated laugh as he described how they would re-educate me once I was locked away. I heard Tiffany agree that my freedom was a depreciating asset they needed to liquidate to save their own failing board of directors. The courtroom froze. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an absolute criminal reckoning. Tiffany reached for her designer purse with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, while Jeffrey stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped as his carefully constructed world crumbled. They weren't shocked by the cruelty of their plan. They were shocked that the daughter they had underestimated had audited their every move. The judge closed the file with a sound like a gavel hitting a terminal sentence. "This petition is denied," he said firmly, dismissed with prejudice. He looked at the bailiff standing by the door. "Call security. I am ordering the immediate detention of Jeffrey and Tiffany for investigation into fraud, forgery of admission documents, and criminal conspiracy." I didn't smile as they were escorted out, their heavy boots making a rhythmic, hollow sound against the floor. I didn't feel the need for a loud celebration. I simply felt the quiet click of the final variable fitting into the equation. As the doors swung shut, I realized that I wasn't the irresponsible child they had imagined. I was the sole heir to an empire I had already mastered, and I was finally untouchable. That night, for the first time in 28 years, the city felt quiet. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse in Brooklyn Heights, the cold air from the East River biting at my skin, but I didn't retreat inside. I let the silence settle over me. Below, the lights of Manhattan shimmered like a vast, complex grid, a system I finally owned. I pulled out my phone. The family group chat was a graveyard of missed calls and desperate, threatening messages. I didn't read them. I didn't save the data. For future audits, I simply hovered my finger over the delete button. In one clinical motion, the digital tether was severed. Silence, no guilt, no noise. I realized then the truth about the power my parents had wielded for so long. It was an illusion, a high-interest loan they could never repay. They confused having with a being. They had the designer clothes, the social standing, and the $30 million expectation, but they lacked the internal capital to sustain it. Their status was a shell company with zero assets. Without Eleanor's money to lease their integrity, they were bankrupt in every sense that mattered. I, on the other hand, didn't just have the logistics empire. I was the architect of its survival. I had the precision, the foresight, and the undeniable truth of 1,000 audited ledgers. My power wasn't a subscription service. It was built into my very DNA. Revenge wasn't the destruction I witnessed in that courtroom. It was survival done so well that the people who spent 20 years trying to diminish me were forced to confront their own terminal failure. As the head of the logistics empire, I didn't need to look back. I was no longer the irresponsible child they imagined. I was untouchable. If you believe that character outlives status, share this video. Let's build a community of survivors who are untouchable. Subscribe for more stories of justice.